It's time to take a new approach to finding true fulfillment in your career, health, and state of mind through insightful conversations with those who have found their professional and personal passions while achieving balance. Whether it's entrepreneurs, athletes, or healthcare professionals, we bring you real people, real growth right here on the Boost Podcast. Now, here's your host, Elena Lipson.
Hey Boost Squad, and welcome to episode 24. Elena Lipson here, and I cannot wait to introduce today's featured guest, Jay Newton-Small. Jay, are you ready to join the Boost Squad?
Absolutely, Elena.
So before we dive into today's episode, I want to give a shout out to our sponsor, Mosaic Growth Partners. Mosaic Growth Partners provides growth strategy consulting to entrepreneurs and organizations in the healthcare and older adult baby boomer market. They can help you bring a new product or service to market, identify and engage new customers and partners, or grow your market share. They also provide coaching and training. For more information, go to mosaicgrowth.com. That's mosaicgrowth.com. Now back to today's featured guest.
So Jay is the co-founder of MemoryWell, which is an online platform that empowers caregivers to provide compassionate and empathetic care. And they do this by having journalists tell the stories of people who can't tell their own, which helps caregivers understand them and improve their quality of life. MemoryWell was launched in September of 2016, and it's off to a really impressive start. Just a few weeks ago, in March 2017, Jay and her team took home the top prize of $130,000 in the launch category for the Inaugural WeWork Awards. Prior to her life as a startup founder, Jay served as the Washington correspondent for Time magazine and is also the author of Broad Influence: How Women Are Changing the Way America Works. Jay has written about everything from Washington politics to foreign policy and national trends. She's covered stories on 5 continents for Time, from conflicts in the Middle East to the earthquake in Haiti to the Scottish independence movement and attacks in Paris. She's also covered the 2008 and 2012 presidential campaigns for Time, as well as Congress and the White House, and interviewed numerous heads of state, including Presidents Obama and George W. Bush, along with senators, governors, and foreign dignitaries. She's written more than half a dozen Time cover stories and contributed to dozens of others. She's a regular contributor on MSNBC and CNN and continues to contribute to Time. So Jay, this latest venture of yours seems to be a bit of a departure from your life as a journalist and a writer. So tell us, what are the 3 things that we should know about MemoryWell?
Well, first of all, Elena, thanks so much for having me on. I'm really excited to be on your podcast. So 3 things about MemoryWell. MemoryWell was really a passion project for me. It grew out of my experience with my dad, who had Alzheimer's. And a few years ago, I put him into a home and they asked me to fill out this 20-page questionnaire about his life. And I was like, you're never going to remember 20 pages of data points for the 150 residents you have here, especially when they're handwritten. So look, I'm a journalist. Why don't you just let me write down his story for you? And I think you'll understand it a lot better. And I did, and they absolutely loved it. And 2 of his caregivers were actually Ethiopian. My dad had spent 20 years doing development work with the United Nations in Africa, 4 of them in Ethiopia. And they had had no idea that he had lived in their country and that he'd actually worked with Emperor Haile Selassie. And they really became his champions. They loved him. They would show him photos of Addis Ababa and Lalibela. And he remembered that time in his life, but he didn't remember sort of the last 30 years. And so it really transformed his care. So I guess one thing I would say is do what makes you passionate. And that certainly grew. It became this ever increasing passion in my life. And ultimately it became my whole life. And now it's my startups. So I guess that's 1. 2, I'm a storyteller by nature. And whether I'm using those talents to chronicle the lives of the powerful, like presidents or presidential candidates or heads of state, or whether I'm using it to write the life story of those living with Alzheimer's dementia, those are the same talents. And I think that it's amazing to see how they can be applied in different ways and to much different effect. So the stories that I wrote for Time magazine would be read by millions of people, but the stories I write now, well, they might only be read by 10 or 15 people, but they have a much deeper impact in that person's life, which can be equally, if not more, powerful as a journalist. And 3, it's definitely about your team. So, Time used to have a strategy. I don't know if I can say this on air, but they used to have a strategy that was no a-holes. Can I say that?
Yeah, I love it. Go for it.
Okay. And I think that it's something that we kept with MemoryWell is the idea that, we really want to love the people that we work with. We really want to support each other and grow together. And we're all really passionate about what we do. And so I had personal experience with Alzheimer's. My co-founder, Andrew Freibush, his mom died when he was very young of cancer, spent a lot of time in hospitals. His father also passed away when he was very young. And so he felt that he really wanted to change the face of medicine. And our third co-founder, Denver Nix, who came with me from time, his grandmother had Alzheimer's as well. So we've all had these sort of personal experiences that have led us here. And that's really powerful. And it really makes for a great team.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's important, especially as a startup, that you all are really aligned on the purpose and the mission and the vision of what you're doing. So coming from similar experiences, you guys definitely have that working in your favor. I also love your policy of no assholes. If only we could go back to every job we've ever had and made that a requirement. I know for me, I probably would have stayed in some positions longer if that had been a rule. But I also like what you talked about with, you wrote this story for your father, and then you found out that two of his caregivers were Ethiopian and they learned about his time working there. And that's probably something that they never would have found out about if you had just answered that 20-question survey that they had given you. And so I think that's something that's really interesting about what MemoryWell is doing, because you're providing details into people's lives that they would just never come up otherwise. And so it allows the caregivers to learn different things about the patients and the care recipients that allow them to connect and provide better care and some emotional connection that might otherwise be lost, without a service like MemoryWell. So I think that's really cool.
Thanks. Yeah. I mean, as you know, most of these care homes experience 55% turnover annually in caregivers, which is just a huge amount of churn. And it's really tough for people like my dad who can't, towards the end of his life, he couldn't speak that much. And it's really hard to articulate who you are to this constantly changing cast of characters. And you're not really sure, do I know this person? Do I not know this person? It makes people anxious. It leads to disjointed care. And so just having this story as your calling card kind of really helps caregivers who often don't speak English that well, might not be able to read your handwriting if you've written things down in forms, just simply and easily digest who is your loved one, what makes them them. And it really does. I mean, studies in the UK have shown that storytelling not only builds empathy between caregivers and residents, but between family members and their loved ones, reduces depression amongst those living with Alzheimer's and dementia, and even increases dexterity, which I think is amazing. So there's a lot of amazing, sort of impactful and powerful ways that these stories can help change these lives.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're just kind of starting to touch on this, but let's go a little bit deeper. When you look at what it's like to care for people with Alzheimer's and other dementias, what do you see now and in the future?
Well, right now it's, the landscape is pretty, I mean, grim in the sense that, we're short, right, in the United States, 1.3 million caregivers. That number is expected to grow by 2020, so not very long away, to more than 2 million caregivers. And, so just as the baby boomer generation is aging and needing more and more assisted living and needing more help and care, we're actually increasingly short workers, which is leading to a sharp decline in the standard of care. And so, there's a ton of money that's going into Alzheimer's and dementia research, but almost all of that is going into medical research. And the fact of the matter is, we're not going to find a cure in time to cure or save the baby boomer generation. And so we need to be paying a lot more attention to how they're being cared for and how they will be cared for. And that's sort of what we're trying to do, is we're trying to find alternative ways to medicine that can increase, or the standard of care that can help them be known, and just sort of help create community and connections. For anyone who's ever been in one of these homes, they're really isolating places and nobody really knows anything about anyone. And just trying to make that into more of a home and more of a community feeling is what we're aiming for here.
Yeah, I think that's great. Could you educate us a little bit on kind of what a traditional home for someone with Alzheimer's and or another type of dementia is like, and like what that experience might be like for them on a daily basis in terms of the interaction they have with the staff and the residents and the type of care they receive?
Well, even for some of the better homes, if you have staff continuity, you're still going to see a little bit of churn and turnover in some of the sort of orderlies and sort of day-to-day handlers of the staff who aren't that highly educated. Most of those sort of regular caregivers, or most of them are immigrants. Most of them don't even have high school degrees. A lot of them don't speak English. And so, to address those problems, we've translated our stories into French, into Spanish, into Chinese, into Tagalog, trying to be able to help caregivers understand the ones that they're caring for a little bit better. Most of care homes, most care homes either don't have Alzheimer's units or just beginning to start them. It's kind of a new thing to have these kind of Alzheimer's units, and so they tend to be smaller. They tend to be sort of a separate corridor, let's say, of a building or a floor of a building. There are a few homes like Art and Courts or Artists that specialize just in memory care, and in that case, their entire facility is memory care. But for the most part, it's sort of just one part of a larger facility. And those larger facilities can be really great. You can have assisted living, independent living. Some of them are so beautiful. I tried to convince my mom to move my dad to her and my dad into one. And she was like, no, that's an old folks home. And I was like, man, I want to live in this old folks home. Some of them are really gorgeous. They take art trips to Europe and have ambassadors come speak about world affairs. And it's super lovely. They play golf. They, do all these things. Unfortunately, it's actually better for those living with Alzheimer's and dementia that they stick with people who are also living with Alzheimer's and dementia, because if they're with people who aren't living with the disease, increasingly they feel inadequate. They know something's wrong. They know that they're not keeping up, and it creates depression. So it's better if you can, even if you're keeping them at home, bring them to memory cafes, bring them to friends groups, bring them to groups where they can interact with other people living with the disease, because they tend to be able to develop their own language and their own communication, and they understand each other. It's sort of the brain is a sort of amazing mystery. They understand each other in ways that we can't begin to fathom, much like toddlers who we know they don't speak language the way we conceive speaking language, but they can totally communicate with each other. It's the same kind of thing. They create these new paths. So that's, we're just really beginning to look at this changing space and changing world of memory care. And I think as more people unfortunately develop the disease, it's an area that's really going to have to be developed a lot more.
Yeah, I think it's great that you guys are looking at new things to do in this space. And one thing that's interesting is you see a lot of innovation happening in older and more established industries, and usually it's around some technology. But what you're talking about is just so basic. It's just writing somebody's story down and being able to share it with people. And even that alone can make such a huge impact. And sometimes I think we get a little too caught up in the technology and lose sight of kind of just the simple things that connect people to each other. And that's just another reason why I think what you guys are doing is just so cool, and it's really easy to understand and to see the impact.
Well, we do have a technological component. So I do say that one of the things, we have a very analog side and we have a very technological side. And I think the analog side is that all of our stories are relatively short. They're one page. So you can print them out and put them up in homes and put them in care logs, laminate them, put them up on walls. And so everyone coming in can read about the people who are there, which I love because it really helps create community. Like I said, my dad used to have this best friend, Warren, who he'd hang out with all the time, and they used to walk together. And every time I saw my dad, I'd be like, hey, Warren, what's up? And then he'd be like, hey, and then that would be it. And I asked the nurses a bunch of times, what's the deal with Warren? And they were like, yeah, I don't know. I don't know what Warren's story is. And so if I'd known what Warren's story was, I absolutely would have engaged him. And I think that that's part of goes to creating community. But we also have a digital sort of version of the story. And so each person's page on our website is anchored by their story. And then family members can upload their loved ones' favorite music and arts and videos and readings. And that sort of also grew out of my experience visiting my dad, in the sense that towards the end, he didn't really know who I was. And he was like, who's this weird girl and her dog following me around? And I'd play him music from my iPhone, his favorite music. And he would stop to listen. And I'd be like, oh, look, and here's your favorite TV show, MASH, and here's photos of Australia, because he was originally Australian, and here's, and so I would have all these sort of things at my fingertips to engage him with, and I knew that if I could keep him engaged for however long I could have his attention, he would sit with me, and it was kind of like my little tool chest of things that I used to engage him. And so that's why we built the site the way we did, so that digitally, family members visiting their loved ones or caregivers sitting with them have all these things about them that they know and they can use to sort of sit with them and hang out with them and get them talking.
Yeah, and I appreciate you making that distinction. And obviously technology does play a role in what you do, but what I really like about it is it's really there to enable that emotional connection between people, and it's not kind of overtaken by the tech aspect of things. And I think that's really cool. So I want to shift gears a little bit. I'm really fascinated with you because, you were this successful journalist for Time Magazine. And for some people, that's the dream, that's the goal. And then you go out and you write this book that comes out during election season when Hillary's running for president about how women are changing the way America works. Your timing was impeccable there. And then you decide to go off and launch this startup and kind of walk away from some of what you were doing at Time and start focusing more of your energy and your time on this startup. And so I want to hear from you sort of your thinking behind that progression and that transition and what that looked like, and talk a little bit about what it's like to go from like being so successful in one career to kind of having to start all over again in another.
Well, it's definitely been an interesting journey, and unconventional one at that. The book on women grew out of a story that I wrote during the government shutdown about the women of the Senate coming together to restart the negotiations to reopen the government when none of the men would talk to each other. And what interested me about that episode was that it was the first time that the women of the Senate had reached 20% of the Senate, and they really ended up having a huge impact that session, the 114th session, which spanned between its congressional sessions are 2 years. So it was between 2012 and 2014. Women actually chaired or ranked on top atop of 11 of the 20 committees, and they produced 75% of the legislation that passed that session. So it was an enormous impact, and they really batted well above their weight. And so I got really interested in the idea of critical mass. So it turns out there's a huge body of research that shows that whether it's a legislature like the Senate or a corporate board, a Navy ship or an appellate court, when women reach that tipping point, somewhere between 20 and 30%, it really is a huge difference. It creates women really change the culture of that institution. And so my book, Broad Influence, which is a play on what used to be a very derogatory word for women, broad, but which increasingly we're reclaiming. It came from the late 1800s and the idea that women had broad hips because they bore children. Well, of course they did. And so we should wear that label with pride. And of course, it's a double entendre, having broad influence. And so, I was really lucky. The timing of that book, Hillary was very generous and gave me an interview for the book, and looking at the challenges that remain for executive office, and both in the private sector and the public sector. And I was the only print interview she did for the first 9 months of her campaign. But I also interviewed Kellyanne Conway and Carly Fiorina and, almost all of the women governors, women senators, women members of Congress, CEOs, four-star generals, chiefs of police, Hollywood actresses. It was a really fun book to do. And so I think of it almost as a passion project because, like my mother and my father, that book was dedicated to my mother who passed away 6 years ago, because she'd had so many struggles with her life and her career. She was a diplomat with the United Nations, an international lawyer. And I think that if she just had critical mass in her workplace, things would have been really, really different for her. And so I like to think it's like my note to my mother beyond the grave being like, look, Mom, things have changed so much and you don't need to worry about me anymore because we've got critical mass where I am. Or at least I did when I was a journalist. I think the startup world is probably very different. But I've been doing politics and journalism for 15 years, and I've been really lucky in my career. And journalism is the art of the curious. And whenever I had a question, time would send me somewhere to answer it, whether it was Iran or Iraq or London or Australia or Indonesia. It was really an amazing experience to be at that level of journalism and to be able to write and to have the world read what you write and have that impact. And I loved it. And it was my dream job when I got it. And I am very proudly remain a contributor to Time because I love them. And I think it's a very special publication. But I think after 15 years of it, it's not that my sense of curiosity disappeared, but you get a little bit not tired of calling balls and strikes, but I wanted to build something of my own. And I wanted to make a difference in the world, not just watch the world and be kind of an observer of it, but interact with it and change things. And so, which I think is a common thing for journalists. And a lot of us kind of reach a point where it's sort of like you're in it for life, or you're going to have to leave, or maybe leave and come back, or leave and do something else. And to be fair, I'm not actually leaving journalism. I'm using my skills, but just in a very different way. but I felt that I could contribute more. And I knew that I would always regret not giving MemoryWell a chance to take off and really see if it could work. Whereas, I've covered 2 White Houses before, covering my third White House. I don't know that that would be such a huge regret missing that.
Yeah, no, I think what you're saying translates really across a lot of industries. After spending a long time, working for other people myself, I started to feel like I wanted to build something for myself too. And it is kind of scary to like leave it all behind, but you start, at least for me, I started to kind of stop appreciating everything I was doing so much because I became so used to doing it. And so when that starts to happen, sometimes it's the right time to go find that next challenge that's going to give you that fire in your belly and kind of spark that same curiosity that your original role, even if it was your dream job, initially inspired. But even so, you and I have talked a little bit about how all these opportunities still come your way from your work at Time and broad influence. And so it's really hard to figure out, when do you kind of have to say no to some of those so that you can really dedicate more of your focus to your startup. And so can you talk a little bit about what that's been like for you? And, as you're going through it now, how do you make some of those decisions?
It is hard. And it is a little bit like having one foot in two fields. And so, for example, I got asked to do a podcast myself recently and about women. And I thought about it and I started to do it. And then I actually turned it down because it felt like going backwards to me. And I really wanted to move forwards. And there are things with, that come my way, stories that people want me to write where I will turn them down because I want to focus on MemoryWell. There are other things, like television. I still do, I don't know, 3 to 6 television hits a week, on MSNBC or CNN, on BBC America, sometimes even on Al Jazeera. And sometimes it's just because they pay me and it's like, it definitely helps sort of, pay the bills when I'm in a place where I'm an entrepreneur and I'm not drawing a salary and I'm, trying to make ends meet. But then other times it's also just good to have, stay relevant, keep in touch with my old contacts in the journalism world. And I do have a particular expertise. I mean, I have not just 15 years of political expertise and a very good sense of Congress and the White House and how both of those work, having covered them for such a long time, but also a very strong expertise in women, given my book. So it's one that is not that common in many ways. So I increasingly, as the women, I thought for sure that there wouldn't be that much interest in my book after Hillary lost. And actually we actually did a third reprint of the book in January because there has been so much demand for it. And there's so many women becoming active politically, so many people becoming interested and active in politics. So that's actually kept up the demand in many ways for me to be on TV and to talk about this stuff, which is a really wonderful problem to have. And I realize that most people who do startups don't have this problem, but it also just, helps me, because my world, MemoryWell still is half in journalism. It does still help keep me relevant in journalism in many ways.
So, you've had all this great success and you're off to such an amazing start with MemoryWell, but why don't you tell us about a time where you might have stagnated or stopped making some progress in your career and how you got things back on track afterward?
Yeah. So, when I'd been covering politics for, let me think, it was 2011. So like 9 years. I came to Washington in 2002 and my mother had died earlier that year and I covered the grand bargain. And I think I ended up making this kind of deal with my bureau chief at the time where I was really burnt out of politics. And I was so disheartened by the failure of the grand bargain. I'd watched Congress, come and play these games of brinksmanship. It used to be really fun, actually, kind of, fun in a relative way, but it used to be sort of brilliant watching these members of Congress manipulate the schedule and like sort of outmaneuver each other into getting these deals, these compromise bills, these huge sweeping bills passed. And that moment, I think in 2011, the failure of the grand bargain to me, and not just to me, I think a lot of political reporters left or soon after that or took a break, was kind of a moment where I became really disheartened with American politics. And I was like, I just don't really want to do this anymore. And it was the first time I'd really thought about leaving journalism. And my bureau chief was amazing and was like, look, why don't you take a break from America and like go try foreign policy, try other things. And I went and I subbed in for Times London bureau chief for a few months while she was writing a book. And got to cover the riots in London, got to cover the collapse of the euro and Libya, the fall of Libya and Gaddafi and the Egyptian revolution. And then I kept covering foreign policy for a few years after that and traveling to Iran and Iraq, Afghanistan, and really it was amazing few years of my life. And I think that I came back much more refreshed and with a sense of like, okay, well, you know what, America is dysfunctional, but other governments are also actually even more dysfunctional in many ways. So
Yeah.
I think it's really always healthy to like take a step away and to question whether you're being challenged and whether you enjoy what you're doing. Because if you don't, then there's no point doing it. Like someone said to me when I was writing my first book, I'm now writing a second book, like you have to absolutely love your topic because you're going to live with it 24/7. And if you don't love it, you're going to hate it and you're going to hate yourself and you're going to never finish it. And I think that that should sort of be the rule for life in many ways. Like, if you don't love what you do and like ever on a daily basis, then you're going to hate it and you're just going to resent it. And so even if you have to like change careers and go back to school, go into debt, do whatever it is you have to do, like, I think it's so worth it, to take that risk like I'm doing now with MemoryWell, not drawing a salary, taking this risk just because I love what I do. I wake up every day and I don't mind working 16, 18-hour days because I love it. And I know that I'm working towards something that I am I'm passionate about and hopefully will be proud of. And if it fails, I'm still learning and I'm still experiencing this incredibly amazing time in my life, with the startup. And so it's worth it to me either way. And so I think if you don't take a risk and if you aren't afraid to fail, if you let your fear of failure paralyze you, then you're never really going to truly live.
Yeah, I think it's interesting how you brought up, sometimes like when you're feeling burnt out with things that you need to kind of take a step back. And I think a lot of people, when they think about that, they think about like going on a vacation or quitting their job. And like really what you're talking about is no, switch it up and try something different. And that can give you energy too. So the answer isn't always to kind of just like completely step away from work altogether or whatever it is that's making you feel burnt out. Sometimes it could just be like changing up maybe the content or the subject of what you're doing or switching things in some way so that then you have a fresh perspective and something to re-energize you. So I really like that. You also talk a lot about how passion drives a lot of your satisfaction with what you do and how you're working a lot now, but you're so passionate about it that it makes it fun and that, it's worth the risk. But talk to me a little bit about how you take care of yourself while you're working these 16 and 18-hour days and doing, 6 TV appearances a week while leading a startup.
Well, I'm not the best person to talk about work-life balance. So let's make that clear. I mean, so the good thing about working for myself is I can go to the gym whenever I want to, right? So right before, we had this call, I was at the gym going for my daily run. I run every day. Otherwise I go insane. I like plan calls that I do. I take long walks and so I'll do calls while I'm walking, which is really nice. And there isn't really like a sense that I have to be in an office any particular time. I can do my work at 3 it's the same thing at 3 a.m., whether it's at 9 a.m. And I can wear leggings to work, except when I'm going on television. And even sometimes I wear leggings going on television, although I don't think that the hosts appreciate that always. But it definitely is a balance. And I think that there are certainly, this weekend I didn't work that much. I mean, I had 2 television hits, but other than that, like I didn't do a ton of work. And sometimes you need time to like unplug and like, chill out with friends and go have like a lovely glass of wine and watch the sunset and cook a great meal and do whatever. And that's just as important, I think, as is working when you really need to work. There's a great book out called Wonderland right now, which I am in the middle of. And it's about basically how some of the world's greatest thinkers spent a lot of time playing. Like, so Darwin would only work like a couple of hours, maybe 5 or 6 hours a week, and would spend the rest of the time just like hanging out and chilling and like experiencing life and exploring and doing other things. And I'm a big believer in that. Like whenever I, am writing and I come to a point where I can't, like I'm like the phrase isn't, I'm like, I can't really, I'm stuck on something. The phrase isn't coming to me. The turn of phrase isn't working. The structure isn't working. I'll go for a run or like, I'll take a break or I'll put it down, turn to something else. And like, even if it's like going to a movie, hanging out with friends. And sometimes in the middle of the night, I always keep a notebook next to my bed. It'll just come to me and I'll be like, oh, that's the phrase, and then it just sort of all works. But I don't try to force it, but that's a luxury that you have with writing, right? Is that, especially writing a book where, like there's other areas you can go and write. You don't have to, it's not on deadline. It's sort of, it has the ebb and the flow to come to you. And it's the same kind of thing with startup work. It's like, well, if I'm bored with this, with this making calls, then I'll do emails. If I'm bored with emails, then I will, do like some writing and fill out some applications, or I'll go chat with like our designer and like figure out some things for the website. So there's always something else that's something different that you can do that I find interesting or challenging. And so I think like I've said before, I think the secret to like being really productive and being good at what you do is just like not forcing yourself to be rote and like do the same thing all the time, but like mixing it up and finding different ways of working. And then just, so that you're constantly moving and trying out different things or doing different things and not stuck constantly always doing that.
Yeah, I agree. I'm a big believer in giving yourself like that space to kind of think creatively. And you can't do that when you're moving from task to task to task. You need to have like that kind of free state where you're either exercising or hanging out with friends and you just are turned off for a little bit, and then your mind kind of uses that time to like recover and connect disjointed thoughts, and you can come up with some really great ideas when it feels like you're not even trying to. So you've given us a lot of great insights today, but let's go ahead and close with a parting piece of guidance for us.
Do not be afraid of failure, because it's the hardest lesson in life, but it's the one that actually yields the most success down the road. And I know that's sort of, I think it's probably like a bit of a meme in Silicon Valley these days. Like people are like super proud of their failures and how much they learn from them. But I definitely think that if you're afraid to fail, you're never going to try. And if you don't try, you're never going to succeed.
Yep, I love that. If you don't try, you are never going to succeed. So I hope today's episode inspires you to think more about how you can find your passion and live your best life. For more information, including links to resources that Jay and I chatted about today and how best to get in touch with her, head on over to our website, theboostpodcast.com, and check out our show notes from this episode and catch the Boost bonus. Jay, I want to thank you for sharing your journey with us. And remember, anything is possible for you.
Now that you've completed this episode, the next step is to join the Boost Squad for strategic insights, tips, and tricks, as well as exclusive resources designed specifically to accelerate your personal and professional growth. All this and more is waiting for you at theboostpodcast.com.